Welcome, everybody, to Nothing Personal, a collaboration in black and white featuring the iconic artists Richard Avedon and James Baldwin. For this exhibition, we have focused on their 1964 book entitled Nothing Personal, and we have made it into an exhibition in order to explore this work of art, this collaborative work of art, that came at such a crucial moment in modern American history. It was published in 1964, and it features 54 photographs by Richard Avedon and a specially commissioned essay by James Baldwin. Richard Avedon and James Baldwin were both born in New York City, and by the time they got to high school, it turned out they went to DeWitt Clinton High School together, which at the time was the largest high school in the United States, and was known for admitting Black people into the school. Baldwin and Avedon met because they both worked on a literary magazine called The Magpie, and their friendship continued throughout the 50s, 60s, and on for the rest of their lives. The book is very interesting in that it is a collaboration between a photographer and a writer. This is not unheard of, but it's fairly rare. The other thing that's very interesting is their shared interest in civil rights, and in some ways this book, you can look at it as a protest book. It brings up issues of civil rights, social inequity, mental illness, and other topics that are still relevant today. For this exhibition, we purchased 2 copies of the original 1964 edition off the internet and cut the books up and mounted them on boards so that each page spread has their own board, and then there's a little line to signify the page turns as you go through the book. Because the designers and the artists that made the book decided to put the date, 1964, even before the title, I think is significant to denote this crucial moment in history, a year following the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. And I think it tries to come into a more positive note, like a playful note, with this man on the beach, curiously with his glasses on and spectacles, making a sandcastle. It's a pretty image. It's also perhaps saying that castles made of sand slip into the sea. It's ambiguous in its statement. And the beach motif really occurs here in the beginning of the book and then finally towards the very end of the book, which we'll get to in a minute. This is where the book really begins, and it is in a series of portraits that Avedon did in the New York City Marriage Bureau. Over a period of several months in the spring of 1961, he would go to the Marriage Bureau and just take pictures of whoever was there. These are not particularly famous people, but I think that this section is about love, which is a major theme in Baldwin's essay. So I think Avedon, for his part, brought these images forward of people that are just recently getting married, committing themselves to each other, and it sort of sets the tone for this part of the book. It's also noted in the book, these are actually gatefolds. The pages fold out. So there's a gatefold of 3, a gatefold of 4, followed by a gatefold of 3. This exhibition is really also about book design in a very important way. And this period of time, sort of mid-century modern design, was extremely popular. And the designer of this book, Marvin Israel, who was the art director at Harper's Bazaar, where Avedon worked, was a leading modernist designer, and really shows in how the images bleed to the edges, images cut across the so-called gutter of the book. And also his use of typography is extremely excellent, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. Following the marriage section, which, as I said, is mostly about love and human commitment to each other, we come to the first part of Baldwin's essay. The essay itself is in 4 sections, and they're dispersed throughout the book. So the first part is Notable typographically in that the designer has made all the columns the same height. And also he employs where the paragraphs end, there's no indentation or space, so it really reads like a block. And I think that's really interesting. The essay itself starts out talking about Baldwin lying in bed in the morning and turning on the television set and watching, and flicking through the channels and seeing the things that he sees. And he describes them in quite a bit of detail here, and it's really a critique of American popular culture, its commitment to solving artificial problems, to sort of a certain view of American masculinity that is displayed in commercials. So that pretty much it's an orientation towards the popular culture of the United States at that time. The first image after the first part of Baldwin's essay is Pearl Mesta, who was a well-known Washington political hostess. And she was notably involved in the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s and even became an ambassador to Luxembourg as a result of her sort of social status in Washington, D.C. I believe the image is included to show kind of more of a historical perspective, an older person that was involved in politics at the time. So after Pearl Mesta's image is a large portrait of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Avedon came to Washington, D.C. to the Daughters of the American Revolution convention at the Mayflower Hotel and made this image. And it's important to note that Daughters of the American Revolution excluded membership of Black people from being part of their organization for many years. Over the years, they did change in the 70s to allow Black women to be involved. And as I understand it now, with the greater emphasis on historical knowledge that we have today and seeing the roles of Black women and Black people in the American Revolution, they are playing a much greater role. So following the Daughters of the American Revolution image, we have a small image of Billy Graham, who was really the first major evangelist in the post-war era. And Billy Graham would lead worldwide crusades for Christ. And he was in favor of desegregation initially. But as the years passed on, he wavered in his commitment to the civil rights movement. It's significant that Billy Graham was included in this book at that time because of the role nowadays that televangelism has come to play in American politics. Next to Graham is Leander Perez, who was a businessman, judge, lawyer in the South, very involved in the oil industry, but he was also extremely opposed to desegregation and did everything in his power politically and monetarily to suppress Black people in the South. And then there's a shift in tone towards popular culture in the depiction of Fabian, who was a famous rock star, sort of seen maybe perhaps to be a replacement for Elvis, as Elvis was aging. And there's another image of the Everly Brothers, who were an extremely popular kind of folk rock band at the time, and in many ways were a precursor to people like the Beatles, who came a little bit after this book, and other rock stars of the time. The next page, we have a small image of Adam Clayton Powell, who was a member of Congress representing Harlem in the 40s. And he really belonged to an older generation of civil rights activists that were more committed to political action and sort of material benefits for his constituents, particularly in labor relations and wages. He was incredibly powerful politically. He was controversial in his time. His white colleagues in Congress did a lot to try to censure him. But he managed to survive quite a while and was a real fighter for his constituents in Harlem. It's notable that his style of being a politician sort of was in contrast to the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, who came more from a religious or cultural point of view and was committed to nonviolence, a new type of protest. And it wasn't in line with Adam Clayton Powell's more material-based politics. There were some controversies between Adam Clayton Powell and Martin Luther King, which you can read about in the captions here. After that, Adam Clayton Powell was known to be extremely stylish. He turned out impeccably dressed with the latest suits and jackets and ties and double-breasted and bow ties. He was extremely dapper. He loved jazz music. His wife was a jazz pianist. So he was very sort of plugged into the culture of Harlem. So on the opposite page from Adam Clayton Powell is Jacqueline Derribes, who was a renowned French aristocrat who became a fashion designer, a socialite, and she's celebrated for her elegance and influence in the haute couture of the 1950s. Also with her is Raimundo de Lorraine, was a celebrated Chilean fashion designer and illustrator who highlighted the influence of Latin American designers in haute couture of that era. Okay, turning the page, we come to perhaps the most controversial page spread in the book. On the left-hand page is depicted the American Nazi Party and George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of that party. And facing that is the poet, the beat poet, Allen Ginsberg, putting the gesture of protection, the Indian mudra for protection. So just the combination of those two images, the Nazi salute and this image of protection, makes this a very dynamic page. Also, the Nazi soldiers are dressed up in uniform, and Allen Ginsberg appears naked, even though he's covering his genital area. The next page has a full-page picture of Killer Joe. Killer Joe was known as a very famous dance instructor. And he got into dance because he didn't like the way his face looked, and he wanted to be able to distract people from looking at his face and admire him for his dancing acumen. Avedon often would do blurry pictures. He often experimented very much with how he depicts his subjects. And this is the first case in the book that's showing this blurry kind of effect. And it just shows Killer Joe as an active, vibrant, and somewhat provocative even looking person. So right after the Killer Joe image, we get the second part of Baldwin's essay. This part of the essay deals with an encounter that he and a white friend of his had in New York City with the police, who just sort of questioned why they were together or how could they be together, and was chastising the white man from associating with a black man. And it really just shows the silent racism of police against anything that doesn't represent sort of a white supremacist view of society. This next section of the book really becomes more politically powerful. It starts with this image of a fist, and it's the fist of Joe Louis, who was a very famous prize boxer at that time, and was shown to be, he had a famous match with a Nazi boxer, and he was defeated the first time, but he came back and defeated the Nazi boxer in the end. It's also significant that this is the appearance of a black fist. That icon of the civil rights movement didn't really catch on until years later, and especially during the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, when Tommy Smith did the famous Black Power sign when he was receiving a gold medal. The next double-page spread is of Jerome Smith and Isaac Reynolds. They were both members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a major force for organizing in the South. Both these men worked closely with Baldwin. They were friends of Baldwin. And one of them attended a very important meeting that Baldwin had with Robert F. Kennedy when he was Attorney General. The next double-page spread depicts George Wallace. It's the only case in the book where there are two images of the same person. George Wallace was a very controversial governor in Alabama, and he ran for president in 1972, and there was an assassination attempt on his life that left him permanently in a wheelchair. I believe that there are two images here because originally Wallace, when he first got into politics, was more sympathetic to desegregation. And however, he saw the political expediency of being anti-Black and pro-discrimination, and he just used that to gain political power. So in a sense, the two faces is about two-facedness, perhaps, showing him as a more sincere person first, and then as a sort of sarcastic or cynical image second. So following Governor Wallace is a double-page spread that just has Dwight David Eisenhower, the President of the United States in the 1950s, who had been defeated actually by John F. Kennedy in 1960. It's a very Eisenhower was kind of wishy-washy on race. He was supportive to some extent, but the tide of political opinion had not really turned in favor of the civil rights movement as a result of Eisenhower. Of equal importance to Eisenhower on the next page is an image of Malcolm X, who both Avedon and Baldwin were familiar with Malcolm X and had talked to him and knew about him and debated with him. And interestingly, the image of Malcolm X is also more in the blurry style of Avedon, which I think, it's hard to interpret exactly why he chose to do that. So turning the page on Malcolm X, we come to a very unusual double-page spread. On the left-hand side is Cheryl Crane, who was the daughter of Lana Turner, the famous Hollywood actress. Digging into Cheryl's background, you'll find that when she was 15, her mother was in an abusive relationship with a man, and Cheryl actually stabbed this man to death in an altercation. And as a result of that, she was institutionalized for a time. And facing that page is Martin Luther King Jr.'s son. And it's a rather light image, skin tone-wise, and the white and the black skin are somehow equated by putting them next to each other. And now turning the page from Martin Luther King III, we turn the page to the oldest living surviving Black slave from the United States. And this image is one of Avedon's most iconic images. It's one that he made with his 8x10 camera. Shows great detail. You can even see the photographer's tripod in the eyes of the slave. And I think it's important to note that, we have the grandson of Martin Luther King on one side of the page, and then immediately over we have the oldest surviving slave. Somewhat interestingly, opposite that page is Adlai Stevenson. And Stevenson was known to be a very progressive politician. He ran for president unsuccessfully several times to try to continue the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies of the New Deal. So turning the page from Adlai Stevenson, we have Harold Arlen. Now, Harold Arlen is someone that most people are probably not too familiar with until you dig a little deeper and discover that he was a very famous songwriter, composer, lyricist, and wrote Somewhere Over the Rainbow and Forget Your Troubles, Come On, Get Happy. So he's a cultural figure of great import, but not necessarily known. He was a kind of behind the scenes figure. But it's perhaps also a note of levity or hope. You know, many of the issues of this book are very difficult and continue to be difficult to discuss. And perhaps adding Harold Arlen was a way to sort of lighten the mood a little bit in the book. On the facing page to Harold Arlen is Arthur Miller, one of America's greatest playwrights. He's particularly noted for writing a play called The Crucible, which was based on the Salem witch trials of the 1600s. He was accused of being communist, but he was a major figure in the cultural scene of the 50s and early 60s. The next image is of Dorothy Parker. Dorothy Parker was a highly influential writer, critic, poet in New York City. She was associated very closely with the New Yorker magazine, which was sort of the cultural digest for people in New York and around the world, really. She was noted for her famous luncheons at the Algonquin Hotel, where literary figures would come and every day they would have some martinis and discuss the topics of the day. Next image after Dorothy Parker, and Parker's images is quite large and bold and very close up. On the facing page is a rather demure picture of Marilyn Monroe. The image was made by Avedon in his studio after a whole day of shooting with Marilyn. And after the shooting was over, he saw her over in the corner looking the way she looks in this image and captured this very poignant image of her. In addition to the fact that Arthur Miller, whose image appears in the book several pages before, I think this image was included. You know, she was certainly an icon of the 1950s. She struggled against being typecast. So to show an image where she is not in her typical glamour mode, I think was quite daring. I also think that while the images don't ever really refer to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, perhaps a sad Marilyn, almost a mourning image of Marilyn in the book might be a reference to the assassination of JFK. The next image is of the doctor and scientist Linus Pauling. Pauling, along with many scientists after the bomb was dropped, many scientists got involved in anti-nuclear efforts and efforts for world peace. And Linus Pauling was certainly one of those scientists who really led a lot of other scientists to become more active in politics. Pauling himself pretty much invented vitamin C, or discovered the efficacy of using vitamin C as a supplement. So the image of Linus Pauling really begins a section of scientists, labor leaders, and others that were also involved in struggles of the civil rights movement. After Pauling comes John Llewellyn Lewis, who was an American labor leader. He was president of the United Mine Workers and established the United Steel Workers unions in the 30s and 40s, and was a big supporter of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though he was himself a Republican. Next, we have Norman Thomas, who was an American socialist, reformer, and activist throughout the 20th century. He was very active in the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union. After that, we have Bertrand Russell, who was a philosopher, a British philosopher. He's the only non-American included in the book. He was very involved in the anti-war movement. He was a pacifist. He organized tribunals to investigate war crimes in Vietnam perpetrated by the United States. So he was a major figure in the intellectual and scholarly community. After Bertrand Russell, we have Major Claude Eatherly. Eatherly was a pilot of the weather reconnaissance plane that preceded the bombing of Hiroshima. So he was the pilot of the plane that flew over the city and sort of checked the weather conditions and gave the okay for the plane to come to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. He didn't really know what he was doing at the time, and when he found out, he pretty much lost his mind to a large extent. It was very, very traumatic for him. He became sort of a petty criminal. He was jailed for a time, but he also became a symbol for the atrocity of the atomic bomb. And I think it's important to note in this case that Avedon often photographed with a completely white background. There's been some speculation about what that means, but in this particular case, it's fairly easy to imagine that the brightness of the background perhaps is a reflection of the explosion of a bomb, the white light that comes out of that. And the fact that Eatherly is squinting and kind of looking into the future is really important, I think. This next section of the book begins with the third part of Baldwin's essay. And in this essay, Baldwin begins to make the case for racism being an actual mental illness that not only affects blacks, but affects whites as well. And this is perhaps the most controversial part of the book, with Baldwin's introduction to the ideas of mental illness that he has. Avedon went to the Louisiana State Mental Hospital for a series of photographs expressly made for the book. And it's a full 20% of the images of the book take place in this mental institution. And they were the most controversial part of the book. They were the part of the book that the most critics couldn't stand to look at, couldn't stand this kind of indictment of American culture. It was too rough. It was too difficult to sort of argue against. But it's certainly a very moving part of the book. It's also very grainy. The images he took were very grainy, almost surreptitiously taken. They're at turns very sad, they're poignant, they're in all quite disturbing. So following this section of the book in the mental institution, the book takes a lighter tone. It returns to the image of the beach that we had in the beginning of the book. And there's a series of images. There's an image of a woman in the surf who's pregnant. And to maybe a modern sensibility, these look a little bit trite as images. But somebody pointed out to me that it was very uncommon to depict a pregnant woman, even in magazines or certainly on television. You couldn't say the word pregnant. You had to say in a family way. So in a sense, maybe this was a slight barrier break, even though it seems a little sentimental at this point. But finally, so there's a couple of images that might seem a little sentimental, but the final image is an extremely powerful group portrait of the student nonviolent, or members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that is the resolution of the book. That is the sort of looking forward to the future, the sort of aspirant level of the book as it ends. Our failure to trust one another deeply enough to be able to talk to one another has become so great that people with these questions in their heart do not speak them. Our opulence is so pervasive that people who are afraid to lose whatever they think they have persuade themselves the truth of a lie and help disseminate it. And God help the innocent here, that man or woman who simply wants to love and be loved. All lives are connected to other lives, and when one man goes, much more than the man goes with him. One has to look on oneself as the custodian of a quality, and a quality of oneself, which is absolutely unique in the world because it has never been here before and will never be here again. But it is extremely difficult in this place and time to look on oneself in this way. Where all human connections are distrusted, the human being is very quickly lost. The light that's in your eyes reminds me of the skies that shine above us every day. So wrote a contemporary lover out of God knows what agony, what hope, and what despair. But he saw the light in the eyes, which is the only light there is in the world, and honored it and trusted it, and will always be able to find it, since it is always there, waiting to be found. One discovers the light in darkness. That is what darkness is for. But everything in our lives depends on how we bear the light. For nothing is fixed forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born. We are responsible to them because we are the only witness they have. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. Nothing Personal is the title of this exhibition. It's also the title of the book that Baldwin and Avedon produced in 1964. It's a very interesting phrase because it means that you are going to hear very many difficult things, but that you mustn't take them personally. Baldwin was a vociferous speaker. He often scared people when he was speaking to them, and it was to make them think. But at the end, he would often say, "Nothing personal." I'm Don Russell. I'm University Curator at George Mason University, and I'm very proud to have organized this exhibition.